and welcome to this screencast. This is a special screencast because it's the last one of this year. Thank you for watching all year long, and I hope this is helpful for you in preparing for our final test, so great. So we start with this idea of pre-Columbian Europe. Perhaps you've heard of pre-Columbian America. We talk about that a lot, especially next year we'll be discussing it a lot. But pre-Columbian America makes sense because when Columbus showed up in the Americas, he changed everything with all of the violence and the disease. But we don't often think about pre-Columbian Europe. But I argue that it makes just as much sense to say pre-Columbian Europe as pre-Columbian America for two reasons. For one thing, the Columbian Exchange ended up changing Europe possibly more than it changed the Americas, although the demographics in the Americas are pretty staggering. But also that Columbus was an effect of the world on Europe as much as it was an effect of the world or of Europe on the Americas. And we can see that just looking at his boats. I mean, you might know that his flagship in the center here, the Santa Maria, may have been found off of Haiti recently. But these boats used technologies that were developed around the world. You can see these lateen sails that we know had existed on dhows in the Indian Ocean Trade Network for possibly thousands of years. And the stern post rudder is a Chinese invention. These, in fact, look very much like early Chinese junks, even though they're much smaller than contemporary Chinese ships. So pre-Columbian Europe is what Europe was like before Columbus brought back the things from America that changed Europe so much, like all the metal, all of the valuable aspects, really changed the trade system of the world. And so in today's lecture, I want to talk a little bit about what areas of Europe really managed to jumpstart that transition. So if we look at Europe in 1492, just before Columbus's voyage, you see this kind of decentralized mess of a place. You look at even places that the Kingdom of France are broken into all these small duchies and lordships and things like that. And that's what we've been talking about with the post-classical Europe. But today we want to talk about two areas that are a little bit different than those other places. I want to talk about Italian city-states, which are an example of how Europe succeeded to some degree in the old trading network, especially in their connection to the Ottoman Empire, and also the Spanish Empire, this conjunction of some smaller Spanish kingdoms, especially the Kingdom of Castile and the Kingdom of Aragon, plus the Kingdom of Portugal, and that kingdom managed to really jumpstart the exploration of Europe into the rest of the world. I don't mean exploration as in discovering new places, but Europe finally participating in the systems of trade that existed before, and eventually in this year, in 1492, reaching the Americas and being the first to connect the Americas to the rest of the world, which was transformational for the whole world. And that's one of the reasons that this class ends with 1492, and your World History 2 class will begin with 1492. There are three things that distinguish these two places from a lot of the rest of Europe and really make them, I think, the places that we can say pre-Columbian Europe ends and perhaps post-Columbian Europe begins. The first one is stable government. Compared to other places in Europe where there's a lot of fighting between feudal lords or different kingships, the United Spain and the city-states both provided governments that were stable enough to allow for the development of other kinds of economies and for exploration. They also allowed for the importation of ideas, both from the past and from around the world. And finally, they taxed trade, not just production. If you remember, feudal systems mostly tax agricultural production, which gives you kind of a very low margin tax rate. But if you're taxing trade, especially if trade is a big part of your business, as it was in both of these places, you can have much higher government revenues, which allow you to build navies, develop standing armies, and really change the way the state works. And that's something that some other states that we've talked about had already developed, most notably the Sudanic states like Mali under Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa's great wealth came from his tax on the import and export. All right, let's dive into this. Let's go to Italy first, because as I said before, these cities in Italy were the real center of Europe's previous connection to the old world trading networks. And there are three cities that maybe explain this very nicely. One of them is Siena, a beautiful city of brick, a center of banking in northern Italy. And this is one of the places, this has the oldest bank in Europe, and one of the places where the idea of commerce really develops. Another one, of course, is Florence, which we'll talk a little bit more later, but you have an intersection of art and ideas, along with a strong economic background. and of course the maritime city of Venice, which is Europe's real connection to the riches of the Ottoman Empire and other places in Southwest Asia. And this area of city-states in Italy lasts from about the 1200s to the 1500s. It includes the period of the Black Death, and it sees intellectual, economic, and political ferment there. Let's look at Florence as kind of an example of how these things work. The first thing we want to talk about are the Medici family. These are a very famous family, and the key thing with the Medici that I want to emphasize, there are lots of really important things throughout this whole presentation, but that I'm going to skip because I don't have time. But the key thing about the Medici family is that they combine traditional nobility with new merchant activity. So the Medici are the bankers for the Pope. At the same time, they have ancient noble connections, and so that's key to the success of the elites in the Italian social system. That they weren't just previous elites, they weren't just merchants, they managed to combine both of those two things together. Another amazing thing about Florence in this period is their development of ideas. People like Plutarch, who is considered the first humanist or the father of humanism, looked back at ancient texts and rediscovered in some ways the idea of observation, of paying close attention. Plutarch was himself mostly interested in writing Latin effectively, but the people who followed him really focused on going back to some of the ancient ideas, the ancient Greek ideas, of observation as the basis for knowledge. Now, they didn't go straight back to the ancient Greek ideas. Remember that the reason they had access to these texts was because of their contact with Islamic states like the Abbasid, the Ilkhanate, and the Ottoman Empire. And so they brought texts that were very old back into current knowledge, and that brought the development of humanism, the idea that through observation we can gain knowledge. And just to point this out quickly, humanism was not initially directly opposed to the church, but over time, those ideas ended up undermining the church anyway. Finally, I want to talk about how some of these things are connected, and one of the places we can look is in damask. The Italians at this time never learned how to make silk themselves. Instead, they made their money off of importing silk and then dyeing it. What they did learn how to make was the dye, and the Medici family, another reason that they got rich was because they found a way to manufacture the dye locally and thereby turn already expensive raw silk cloth into very expensive woven silk dyed fabrics. And so that's kind of the same things that I talked about before. We have the Medici family represent a stable government based on these new ideas of economics, plus Plutarch and other humanists who are importing these previous ideas, changing the way people are thinking, and of course this focus on trade and taxing these manufactured goods production and the trade of those manufactured goods once again allows the Medici family or other ruling families to gain power. I wish I could talk about this for a lot more, but there's tons of this in Stearns, tons of this online. This is just an introduction to basically why we should be studying this. And once again, the reason that Italy manages to gain this power is because they are connected to this very wealthy Ottoman Empire. We haven't talked about the Ottoman Empire that much because they will continue to be such an influence during the pre-modern period, and we will study them in more detail then. The next place we want to go is Spain, and the key event here is in 1492. These two beautiful people get married, Ferdinand and Isabel. Ferdinand is from the kingdom of Castile, Isabel is from the kingdom of Aragon, and as they get married, they unite Spain in this marriage alliance, and suddenly the Iberian Peninsula is once again dominated by a united political force. Now, we don't want to forget the huge influence of Muslim Iberia on this new place too. So, for instance, the mosque in Cordoba becomes a church, and many of the cities that existed in this new Spain were built mostly by Muslims and then were adapted for Christian use. That's kind of silly to say because obviously the Muslims and Christians are actually using them similarly. But still, we can't forget the influence of Muslim architecture and Muslim techniques on Spain at this time. The next thing is that the Spanish and the Portuguese begin to try to expand outwards. Now, we've talked a little bit about why they would do that, and one of the key reasons is that the Italians controlled the key trade connection to the Ottoman Empire here. The Spanish couldn't trade this way, and so they tried to trade this way. And even before 1492, they have success, both the Spanish and the Portuguese, trading with West Africans and trading for gold, trading for salt, and those are very valuable trading exchanges in their own right. And that's kind of what spurs them to try to then send a ship out this way to reach the riches over here. And we know how that turns out. Columbus, of course, ends up in Hispaniola, the island that now includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the world was changed forever, with horrible death on the part of the people who lived there, and on great riches on the part of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And within 100 years, the world has completely changed. The network of trading systems that we saw during the post-classical period was focused here in Southwest Asia. But by this time, the network has changed, and it is now focused in Europe. And basically, before, everything went through Baghdad. Now everything goes through Spain, and eventually everything will go through my hometown of New York City. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great time. Work hard. Have fun.